How do you face the fires in your life? God's people are going through a very difficult time. The nation of Babylon has come and literally burnt their homes to the ground. They're discouraged. They're angry at God for allowing this to happen. God speaks to them through Isaiah chapter 54 and says, "Behold, I have created the blacksmith who blows the coals of the fire and brings forth an instrument for his work." He says, this life is an awful lot like the fire of a blacksmith. And though I didn't create evil or suffering or the fires of life, I can use the fires of difficulty to fashion you and to shape you into an instrument of good. In the nation of Babylon, modern day Iraq, King Nebuchadnezzar has transported those from Judah into his land, Sharack, Meshack, and Abednego, and he puts them to the ultimate test. You must deny your priorities, your convictions, and your God. You must bow down to me and to my image. And if not, I will throw you into a fiery furnace. These three teenagers have no scriptures, they have no support system, they have no church, they have no mom and dad nearby. Will they pass the ultimate test? The king turns to them and says, if you don't bow down to me, I will heat that furnace 7 times hotter. And what God could rescue you from my hands? Do you serve a God that can rescue you from death? They turn to him and say, we do serve a God who can defeat death. And he will rescue us from the fire. But if not, we still wouldn't bow down to you. And we still wouldn't worship your gods. But if not. 2,500 years later, those 3 words come on the scene during World War II. It's 1940. The Nazis have backed the English soldiers into Dunkirk, France. The Germans tell them they better surrender or die. Family and friends back in England are wondering what will happen to their friends, their family members. The captain of the English troops sends a 3-word cryptic telegraph. Those 3 words were, but if not. This becomes a battle cry. We will not back down to Nazi Germany. We will trust in God no matter what the consequences. They get into fishing boats, private cruisers, even an Olympic yacht, and they travel across the English Channel. And that night, in the midst of darkness and the potential of enemy fire, they rescue all 350,000 men because of a simple telegraph. But if not. Historians call this the miracle at Dunkirk. These 3 words, but if not, they inspired teenagers to stand up in the face of Babylon to a fiery furnace. They inspired soldiers and families and friends to face certain danger in the midst of Nazi Germany. See, they believed in a blacksmith who enters into the fire with us. They believed in a blacksmith that doesn't watch from a distance, but enters into our suffering and our difficulty. They believed in a blacksmith that pulls beautiful instruments out of the fire. See, King Nebuchadnezzar was looking into the fire. He threw 3 men into the fire, Sharack, Meshack, and Abednego. But in his journal, historians tell us that he records that he saw 4 men in the fire. And the 4th wasn't like an angel, it was like the Son of Man, the Son of God. Bible scholars tell us that it was Jesus appearing in the Old Testament, entering into the flames with these men. The God who enters our suffering. He suffers with us, and he ultimately defeats death. He rescues them from death. 600 years later, Jesus will take on the ultimate fire of death and destruction. He'll enter the ultimate furnace of death itself when he dies upon a cross. And everyone thinks it's over. It's done with. He's died. He's laying in a grave. And yet 3 days later, the scriptures tell us that Jesus trusts God to raise him from the dead. And sure enough, he too trusts in a God who enters into our difficulty and can rescue us from death. Because 3 days later, he will step out of the grave and he will show himself victorious and bring joy and peace and ultimately the confidence that even death itself can be overcome. This is the message of Easter. This is the message of Jesus. King Nebuchadnezzar is stunned. A God who can defeat death? The God of the universe that enters into the fire with those who trust in him? As Sharack, Meshack, and Abednego come out, they're unharmed. They're rescued from the fire. He says, I want to know a God like that. A God who's up close and personal and yet can defeat death for those who trust in him. All through history, followers of Christ have trusted in him. We're not surprised when the fiery trial comes upon us because we know life is a lot more like a fire than it is like a vacation. And yet God doesn't abandon us. He is the great blacksmith who cares for us. and takes even the bad, evil, suffering in our life and brings forth instruments of good to those who trust in him. He refines us. He molds us. He shapes us when we place our life in his hands.